Imagine a world where your very existence was a whispered suggestion, a legal ghost trailing behind a man. What if your rights, your voice, your safety, your children, and even your own body were not truly yours? How could you navigate life, find happiness, or seek justice in 820, when the law literally refused to see you? Number 7. The invisible woman, when your very existence is questionable. In the year 820, across vast stretches of the known world, from the sprawling domains of Charlemagne's heirs in Francia to the bustling markets of Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate, and far east to the imperial courts of the Tang dynasty in China, the legal landscape for women was, to put it mildly, one of the most fundamental and pervasive harms caused by a lack of legal identity was the sheer invisibility of women in the eyes of the law. They were, in essence, not persons with individual rights and standing, but rather extensions of their male relatives, fathers, husbands, brothers, and eventually sons. This wasn't merely a social custom, it was deeply embedded in the legal codes, if such formal codes even existed in every region, or in the customary laws that govern daily life. Consider the notion of legal personality. Today, we understand this as the ability to hold rights and responsibilities. You can own property, sign contracts, initiate lawsuits, and stand as a witness in court in 820 AD. For most women, this concept was almost entirely foreign. A woman could not, in many societies, legally own land in her own name. If she inherited land, it was often managed by a male guardian, or it became part of her husband's estate upon marriage with her, having little to no independent control over it. For example, in the Frankish kingdoms, influenced by Salic law and various Germanic customs, a woman's inheritance was severely restricted, particularly concerning ancestral land, which was often reserved for male heirs to ensure continuity of lineage. While some women from aristocratic families might wield significant informal influence, or even manage estates, this was often done through their male connections, and their legal claim remained tenuous. This absence of direct ownership had cascading effects. Imagine trying to engage in commerce without the ability to own property. How could one secure a loan without the right to sign contracts? How could one enter into agreements for trade or business ventures? A woman might participate in local markets, selling goods she produced at home, but any larger-scale economic activity, any significant transaction, would typically require the involvement and legal standing of a male relative. Scholars studying this period often point to the ways women's economic contributions were often confined to the domestic sphere or to informal, unregulated activities, precisely because formal economic structures excluded them. They might be skilled artisans, weavers, or brewers, but their enterprise lacked the legal recognition that would allow for expansion, protection, or even independent profit. Their earnings, if any, often legally belonged to their husbands or fathers, further eroding any semblance of economic independence. The inability to legally own meant that women were incredibly vulnerable. If a husband died, his property, even that which might have come from his wife's dowry, would often pass to his male heirs, not directly to his widow. She might be granted a dower portion for her upkeep, but control remained out of her hands. This left many widows in precarious positions, dependent on the goodwill of their deceased husband's family, or the terms of a will that she had no part in creating or enforcing independently. Records from various parts of the Byzantine Empire, for instance, show varying degrees of protection for widows. But even there, a woman's control over inherited wealth was often subject to the oversight of a male guardian, or the stipulations of the deceased's will, which again she had no direct power to alter. Furthermore, this legal invisibility meant a woman could not, as a rule, represent herself in court. If she had a grievance, if her rights were violated, if someone stole from her, or if she was harmed, she could not simply walk into a courtroom and demand justice. She needed a male guardian, a husband, father, brother, or sometimes a designated legal representative, to act on her behalf. Her voice, her testimony, her very presence in the legal sphere was mediated through a man. This profoundly undermined her ability to seek redress for wrongs, as her access to justice depended entirely on the willingness and capability of a male relative to champion her cause. This wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a fundamental barrier to legal protection and autonomy. Consider a situation where a woman's dowry, her contribution to the marriage that was supposed to provide some security, was misappropriated by her husband's family. Without legal standing, she could not sue to recover it. Her only hope rested on a male relative taking up her fight, a fight that might not always be in his own immediate interest. The idea of making a will, a document that expresses your wishes for the distribution of your property after death, was largely unattainable for women in many societies of 820. Since they couldn't own property independently in the first place, or their ownership was so circumscribed, the concept of bequeathing it was often moot. This meant that even in death, a woman's desires about her personal possessions, her accumulated wealth, or her preferences for her children's future were often legally irrelevant, overridden by patriarchal laws of succession that privatized male lineage. This erasure extended beyond property to her very legacy, as her contributions, her life story, and her personal connections were rarely acknowledged in formal legal documents or historical records. In the vast lands under the Tang dynasty, women, particularly within aristocratic families, might wield considerable informal influence and manage household affairs with great skill. Yet, even there, the formal legal codes influenced by Confucian principles largely subordinated women to men. Property, rights, inheritance, and legal standing were overwhelmingly skewed in favor of male heirs and heads of households. A woman's identity was primarily defined by her relationship to men as a daughter, wife, or mother, rather than as an autonomous individual with independent legal claims. This meant that while a Tang noblewoman might oversee a large estate and command many servants, her legal capacity to act independently, particularly in the public or judicial spheres, was severely limited. The everyday implications of this legal invisibility were staggering. It meant a constant state of dislegal invisibility were staggering. It meant a constant state of dependence. It meant that a woman's security, her economic well-being, her very survival, often hung precariously on the benevolence or competence of the men in her life. It fostered a system where abuse or neglect could go unchecked because the victim had no independent legal channel for recourse. Without a recognized legal identity, a woman was, in essence, a minor for life. Forever under guardianship, forever an object of legal protection rather than a subject with inherent rights. This foundational lack of recognition was the bedrock upon which many other harms were built, profoundly shaping the lives of women in 820 AD and ensuring their diminished status in a world defined by male power and privilege. Number 6. The unbreakable bonds, marriage as a cage, not a choice. In 820 AD, the concept of marriage for most women was a world apart from our modern understanding of a union based on mutual consent and affection. Instead, it was overwhelmingly seen as an economic, social, and political arrangement between families, with the woman often serving as a key commodity in these transactions. The profound harm here stemmed from the lack of legal identity that denied women agency in choosing their partners, limited their ability to escape abusive situations, and often stripped them of their autonomy once wed. This wasn't just about personal heartache. It had deeply rooted legal ramifications that shaped their entire lives. The idea of free choice in marriage was, for the vast majority of women, a distant dream. Marriages were typically arranged by fathers or male guardians, sometimes even when the prospective bride was still a child. These arrangements were driven by considerations of land, wealth, political alliances, or consolidation of family power, not by the young woman's desires or well-being. For example, chronicles from the Carolingian Empire frequently mention strategic marriages between noble families, where daughters were married off to solidify peace treaties or expand influence, often across vast distances, and to men they had never met. The legal framework offered no avenue for a woman to refuse such a match. Her refusal would not only be socially unacceptable, but could also be legally unenforceable, as her guardian had the right to arrange her marriage. This meant that a woman could be legally compelled into a union that brought her no joy, only hardship, or even danger. Once married, a woman's lack of legal identity became even more pronounced, particularly concerning her person and her property. In many legal traditions, particularly within the Roman-influenced and Germanic customary laws prevalent in Europe, a woman's legal personhood was subsumed by that of her husband. This concept, often referred to as coverture, meant she lost independent legal standing. Her husband became her legal guardian and representative. This had devastating consequences for her autonomy. She could not own property independently of her husband, nor could she enter into contracts without his consent, or even initiate legal proceedings without his direct involvement. Any property she brought into the marriage as a dowry typically passed into her husband's control, even if it was technically meant to revert to her if the marriage ended or she became a widow. This often made her financially dependent on her husband and his family, severely limiting her options should the marriage prove untenable. Divorce, for women, was an almost impossible dream in many societies of 820-odd. While men might have avenues for divorce, often based on grounds like barrenness, insubordination, or infidelity, women rarely did. In Christian Europe, the Church was increasingly solidifying the indissolubility of marriage, making divorce exceptionally rare for anyone, but particularly inaccessible for women. Even separation was difficult without male familial support. In some Islamic legal traditions, while men had the right to repudiate their wives, talaq, a woman's right to initiate divorce, khula or fash, was far more restricted, often requiring her husband's consent or proof of severe harm, which could be difficult to obtain without legal standing or a supportive male guardian. For instance, in Abbasid Baghdad, a woman seeking divorce might need to prove her husband was impotent, insane, or utterly neglectful. And even then, the process was arduous and depended on the interpretation of judges' indeciberation. If a husband was cruel, violent, or neglectful, a wife had little to no legal means to escape. Her complaints might fall on deaf ears, as customary laws often viewed marital disagreements as private matters. Even as she sought help from her own family, they might be reluctant to intervene if it jeopardized social standing or economic alliances. The lack of legal identity meant she couldn't simply leave and establish an independent life. She had no property, no independent income, and no legal protection if her husband pursued her. This profound lack of agency created a system where women were often compelled to endure intolerable situations, their well-being and safety secondary to the perceived stability of the marriage and the family's honor. Furthermore, the very purpose of marriage from a legal and societal perspective was often centered on producing male heirs. A woman's value and status were intrinsically tied to her ability to bear children, particularly sons, who would carry on the family name and inherit property. If a woman was barren or only bore daughters, her position within the marriage could become precarious, even leading to repudiation or the husband taking a second wife, often without her consent or any legal recourse for her. This created immense pressure on women, reducing their identity to a reproductive function, further diminishing their individual worth beyond this capacity. The dowry system prevalent in many societies, while sometimes offering women a theoretical form of security, often tied them even more firmly into the marital structure. The dowry, property or money brought by the bride's family to the marriage was often managed by the husband. If the marriage ended particularly through divorce, or if the wife died without producing heirs, The dowry's fate was often uncertain. In many legal systems, it would revert to her husband's family, or its return to her family might be contested. This meant that the very thing that was supposed to provide her some financial safety could become a source of legal dispute that she, as a legally invisible entity, could not independently navigate. In essence, marriage in 820 had for a woman often served as the primary legal mechanism for her social placement, but it came at a significant cost to her autonomy. It was a bond that was often unbreakable from her perspective, a system designed to secure male lineage and property, rather than to protect her individual rights or facilitate her personal happiness. The absence of legal identity meant that her voice in this most fundamental institution of human life was silenced, her choices limited, and her vulnerability amplified, turning what might have been a partnership into, for many, a legally sanctioned form of dependence and constraint. Number 5. Whispers in the courtroom. When your voice holds no weight, imagine standing accused of a crime or witnessing a terrible injustice and knowing that your words, your testimony, your very presence in the legal arena held little to no official weight. This was the crushing reality for women in 820 AD, where a profound lack of legal identity often rendered their voices mere whispers in the courtroom, if they were heard at all. This wasn't merely a social slight, it was a systemic legal barrier that severely limited their access to justice, protection, and the ability to defend themselves or others. At the heart of this harm was the widespread principle that women lacked the full legal capacity to testify or to initiate legal proceedings independently. In many legal systems of the time, the testimony of a woman was considered less reliable, less credible, or even inadmissible compared to that of a man. For example, in parts of the Carolingian Empire, influenced by Germanic laws, the concept of a woman's limited legal capacity meant she usually could not swear an oath or act as a witness in court unless accompanied and supported. Her words alone, even if she had seen a crime or was herself a victim, often held insufficient evidentiary value to sway a judge or jury. This directly perpetuated injustice, as crimes committed against women or in their presence could often go unpunished simply because the primary witness or victim was a woman whose testimony was deemed inadequate. Consider the implications for seeking justice for violent crimes. If a woman was the victim of theft, assault, or even rape, her path to legal redress was fraught with insurmountable obstacles. She could not, as a rule, independently bring a lawsuit against her assailant. She needed a male relative or guardian to act on her behalf, to file the complaint, and to present the case. This immediately created a filter. If her father, husband, or brother was unwilling or unable to pursue the case, perhaps due to fear of reprisal, a desire to maintain family honor by not publicizing the incident, or simply a lack of resources, then the crime often went unpunished. The harm to the woman was not only the initial offense, but also the profound psychological burden of being denied any avenue for legal vindication. Justice was not blind, it was profoundly gendered, and often it simply looked away from women's suffering. In the legal traditions of the Abbasid Caliphate, while Islamic law recognized women's right to own property and engage in certain economic activities, their legal standing in court was still often curtailed. In some schools of thought, the testimony of one man was considered equivalent to that of two women in certain types of cases, particularly those involving financial transactions or certain criminal matters. This disparity in evidentiary weight meant that even where women could testify, their words carried less inherent authority, requiring corroboration from another woman or a man to be fully accepted. This principle, while varying in application across different regions and legal schools, consistently underscored a pervasive societal view that women's perceptions or judgments were somehow less reliable or trustworthy than those of men, severely impacting their ability to present a compelling case. Furthermore, a woman's lack of independent legal standing meant she could rarely defend herself effectively if she was accused of a crime. She would need a male representative to speak for her, to present her defense, and to navigate the complexities of the legal system. This meant that her fate rested entirely on the eloquence and commitment of her male advocate, rather than her own ability to articulate her innocence or present her case. Imagine being falsely accused of theft or slander and being unable to directly confront your accuser or present your own alibi without a male guardian's approval and active participation. This system inherently put women at a severe disadvantage, making them vulnerable to malicious accusations and limiting their ability to protect their reputation and freedom. The concept of family honor also played a significant, often detrimental role. In many societies of 820, a woman's purity and conduct were inextricably linked to the honor of her male family members. If a woman was raped, for instance, it was often viewed not primarily as a crime against her person, but as an affront to her father's or husband's honor, or as a stain on the family's reputation. This perspective could lead to pressure on the victim to remain silent, to avoid publicizing the event, or even to be blamed for it rather than seeking legal recourse against the perpetrator. The legal system, being a reflection of these societal norms, offered little refuge, often prioritizing male honor over a woman's safety and right to justice. This silencing mechanism, compounded by the legal invisibility, ensured that many crimes against women simply disappeared into the shadows, unrecorded and unpunished. In the Byzantine Empire, while Roman legal traditions had historically offered women certain rights, the early 9th century saw a continuation of patriarchal norms that limited women's public roles and legal independence. Women could own property, but their capacity to manage it independently or to engage in legal disputes without a male guardian was still often restricted, particularly in higher courts or in cases involving complex legal transactions. This meant that while a Byzantine woman might theoretically possess more rights than her European counterpart in some respects, the practical application of these rights in court often still depended on male mediation and societal acceptance. In essence, for women in 820, the courtroom was not a neutral arbiter of justice, but a space where their legal identity was largely nullified. Their voices were muted, their testimony discounted, and their ability to seek or defend justice was almost entirely dependent on the will and capacity of men. This systemic exclusion from the legal process ensured that many wrongs against women went unaddressed, fostering a climate of impunity for aggressors and reinforcing the profound vulnerability that came with their lack of independent legal identity. It was a world where justice was not just blind, but often deaf to the experiences of half the population. Number 4. The shadowed hearth. When even your children aren't truly yours. For women in 820, the profound lack of legal identity often extended to the most intimate and cherished aspect of their lives, their children. Prevailing legal and social norms of the time often dictated that children, especially sons, belonged primarily to the father's lineage and family. This meant that women frequently had little to no independent legal rights over their offspring, severely impacting their ability to make decisions about their children's upbringing, education, future, or even to retain custody in the event of separation, divorce, or widowhood. This was a deep and heart-breaking harm, as it undermined the fundamental bond between a mother and her child, often reducing her role to that of a caregiver rather than a legal parent with autonomous rights. In many parts of the world, particularly within the Carolingian Empire and other Germanic-influenced societies, patrilineal descent was paramount. Children were considered to belong to the father's clan, carrying his name and inheriting through his line. This had significant legal implications for women in the event of a divorce or separation, which, as discussed earlier, was already incredibly difficult for women to initiate. Custody of the children almost invariably went to the father or his family. The mother, having no independent legal standing or claim to her children, would often be forced to leave them behind. Imagine the agony of being denied access to your own flesh and blood, knowing that the law offered no protection for your maternal bond, simply because your identity was subsumed by your husband's. Historical records, though scarce on the emotional nuances, suggest countless women experienced this profound loss, unable to challenge these legal realities. Even within marriage, a mother's legal authority over her children was often secondary to that of her husband. Decisions about a child's education, their future spouse, their religious upbringing, or their career path were typically made by the father. While mothers undoubtedly exerted significant influence within the domestic sphere, particularly in the early years of a child's life, this influence was informal and contingent upon the father's approval. If a father decided to send a child away for education or apprenticeship, or to arrange a marriage for a young daughter, the mother had little legal power to object, regardless of her own desires for her child's welfare. Her legal identity was so intertwined with her husband's that her parental rights were in essence an extension of his. The vulnerability of widows was particularly poignant in this regard. When a husband died, his children, especially sons, remained members of his family and heirs to his property. While a widow might be permitted to remain with her young children, particularly if she was granted a dower portion or managed the estate on behalf of her minor sons, her ultimate authority was often limited. If the husband's family wished to take the children, especially older sons, to raise them within their own household or to prepare them for their inheritance, the widow often had little legal power to resist. Her right to remain with her children was often conditional, tied to her conduct and the goodwill of her in-laws, rather than an inherent legal right derived from her motherhood. This was a critical source of insecurity, as it meant that even after bearing and raising children, a woman could find herself legally alienated from them, her role reduced to temporary custodian in some Islamic legal systems prevalent in the Abbasid Caliphate. While mothers generally had a strong right to custody of young children, particularly during infancy and early childhood, this right typically diminished as the children grew older. For instance, after a certain age, often around 7 for a boy and puberty for a girl, the father's right to custody usually became paramount. The rationale was often rooted in the father's responsibility for the child's religious education, protection, and upbringing in the patrilineal family structure. While this provided some initial protection for mothers, it meant that the longer-term decisions and ultimate legal control over children's lives still largely rested with the father. This created a situation where a mother might nurture her child through their formative years, only to see legal control shift entirely to the father or his family, leaving her with no ongoing legal say in their lives. In Tang China, the emphasis on filial piety and patriarchal lineage meant that children belonged unequivocally to the father's family. A wife's status was primarily defined by her role in producing male heirs for her husband's lineage. If a marriage ended through divorce or the husband's death, the children almost invariably remained with the paternal family. The mother had no legal claim to them. This system, deeply embedded in Confucian principles, ensured the continuity of the male line and the family's ancestral worship. While a mother's emotional bond and informal influence were certainly recognized within the household legally, her children were not her own in the independent sense. This meant that women were often denied the satisfaction and security of knowing they could independently raise their children according to their own values and wishes, and that their emotional investment had a corresponding legal recognition. The ramifications of this lack of legal parental identity were far-reaching. Often meant that a woman's emotional and physical labor in raising children received no corresponding legal recognition or protection, deepened her dependence on men, as her ability to remain with her children or influence their lives was contingent on her marital status or the goodwill of her male relatives. It limited her ability to plan for her children's future independently, to safeguard their inheritance, or to ensure their well-being if her own circumstances changed. The shadowed hearth represented not just a lack of physical comfort, but a fundamental lack of legal power over the most precious human connections, leaving women emotionally vulnerable and legally dispossessed of their own legacy through their children. Number 3. Bread and chains. The impossible road to economic freedom. In the year 820, the dream of economic independence for women was, for most, a fleeting illusion tightly constrained by a profound lack of legal identity. This absence meant that women were systematically excluded from formal economic structures, denied the right to own and control property, and often had their labor and earnings legally appropriated by male relatives. This wasn't just about having less money. It was about a fundamental lack of agency, a perpetual state of financial dependence that severely limited their opportunities, choices, and ability to escape hardship. The road to economic freedom was not merely difficult. For many, it was legally impossible. The most glaring obstacle was the near-universal inability of women to independently own land or substantial property. Land was the primary source of wealth and power in agrarian societies across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. In the Carolingian Empire, for instance, customary laws and emerging feudal structures largely reserved land ownership and inheritance for male heirs, ensuring the continuity of family lines and military service. While some aristocratic women might administer estates on behalf of their husbands or minor sons, their ownership was often tenuous or conditional, and they rarely had the right to buy, sell, or mortgage land independently. This meant that women, even those from wealthy families, were often landless in their own legal right, lacking the most fundamental asset for wealth creation and security. This lack of property ownership had immediate consequences for economic activity. Without collateral, in the form of land or legally recognized assets, a woman could not secure loans from a merchant or a moneylender. Without the ability to enter into legally binding contracts, she could not establish a business, engage in large-scale trade, or participate in the burgeoning commercial networks of the time. While women were undoubtedly active in local economies, spinning, weaving, brewing, selling produce, or working as domestic servants, their economic activities were typically informal, small-scale, and often entirely subordinate to their male guardians. Their earnings, if any, were often legally considered the property of their husband or father, reinforcing their financial dependence. Consider the life of a woman in a rural village in Francia. She might work tirelessly in the fields alongside her husband, contributing directly to the family's survival. She might raise livestock, cultivate a garden, or produce crafts for sale. Yet, the land she toiled on was not legally hers. The produce of her labor was not legally hers to dispose of independently, and any earnings she generated were legally subject to her husband's control. This meant that despite her undeniable economic contribution, she had no independent claim to the fruits of her labor, no leverage to demand a share, and no separate savings she could legally control. This created a pervasive economic vulnerability, as her well-being was entirely tied to the financial solvency and goodwill of her husband. In the Abbasid Caliphate, while Islamic law in principle granted women certain rights, including the right to own property and engage in trade, the practical application often varied greatly depending on local customs, the social class of the woman, and the vigilance of her male guardians. While some urban women might indeed own shops or participate in markets, their legal autonomy was still often circumscribed by the need for male representation in formal transactions or the prevailing societal norms. That discouraged women from extensive public economic engagement. Even if a woman owned her own property, her husband often had considerable control over her affairs or access to her wealth, especially if he was responsible for her maintenance. The legal texts suggest a right, but the societal execution often placed chains on her economic freedom, subtle but powerful. The inability to independently manage one's finances or own significant assets had profound implications for social mobility. Without economic leverage, women found it incredibly difficult to improve their social standing, escape poverty, or gain influence beyond the domestic sphere. They were trapped in their inherited circumstances, their economic fate largely determined by the men they were born to or married. This lack of economic independence meant that leaving an unhappy or abusive situation was incredibly difficult, if not impossible. A woman might have nowhere to go, no means to support herself, and no legal standing to establish an independent life. Her reliance on her male relatives was not just a social norm, but a legal imperative for survival. Even for aristocratic women who managed vast estates, their economic power was often mediated through their male relatives. A powerful Byzantine empress might hold immense sway, but the legal framework still largely privileged male succession and control of imperial finances. Similarly, a wealthy Tang noblewoman might oversee a large household economy, but her direct ownership and control over the family's ancestral lands or wealth were subject to the ultimate authority of the male head of the household. Their influence was often informal, built on personal charisma and familial connections, rather than a robust, independent legal economic identity. The absence of a clear legal identity for women meant that their economic contributions, while crucial to the functioning of society, were often undervalued and unrecognized in formal systems. Their labor was often seen as part of the household economy, not as independent enterprise. This created a systemic disadvantage, ensuring that women, regardless of their skill, intelligence, or industry, remained largely excluded from the levers of economic power and opportunity. It perpetuated a cycle of dependence where their survival and well-being were inextricably linked to the fortunes and decisions of men, leaving them in a constant state of financial precariousness and profoundly limiting their ability to shape their own lives. It was, in essence, a world where the ability to earn bread did not necessarily mean the freedom to control it, leaving many women in invisible chains of economic subjugation. Number 2. The silent suffering. Protection beyond reach. In the early 9th century, the lack of legal identity for women manifested in one of its most devastating forms, a systemic absence of effective protection against violence and exploitation. When a woman's legal personhood was either non-existent or severely diminished, her physical safety and bodily integrity became incredibly vulnerable, often seen not as her inherent right, but as an aspect of her male guardian's honor or property. This translated into a world where assault, abuse, and exploitation could occur with alarming frequency, often without fear of legal recourse for the perpetrators, leaving women to endure a silent suffering, their cries for justice largely unheard by the law. Domestic violence, for instance, was rarely considered a crime against the woman herself in many legal systems of 820 ad hatter. Instead, it was often viewed as a private family matter, or, at most, a matter for the family elders to resolve. A husband's authority over his wife was broad, and physical discipline was often implicitly or explicitly sanctioned by customary law. A woman who was beaten or abused by her husband had virtually no legal avenues for protection. She could not initiate a lawsuit against him, nor could she seek a legal separation easily, as discussed previously. Her family might intervene, but their intervention would be based on social pressure, not legal entitlement, and could often put their own standing at risk. The legal system simply did not see her as an independent entity, deserving of direct state protection from harm within her own home. Sexual violence, such as rape, also highlighted this profound lack of protection. In many legal traditions, rape was often framed as a crime against the father or husband, a violation of his property or honor, rather than a brutal assault on the woman's person. This distinction had critical consequences. The legal focus might be on the woman's chastity or honor, rather than the violence she endured. If a woman was married, the crime might be seen as an offense against her husband's property. and the compensation or punishment might be directed towards him, not necessarily to the woman herself. If she was unmarried, her defilement might lead to her being considered unmarriageable, further harming her prospects, and again, the legal focus could be on the loss of her value to her family rather than the violence against her. Furthermore, the legal system often placed a heavy burden on the victim to prove the crime, which was incredibly difficult given the societal norms and lack of legal identity. A woman's testimony might be insufficient without male corroboration. If she was raped, for instance, she might face intense scrutiny and skepticism, and the very act of bringing the accusation could bring shame upon her and her family, making it less likely that she would even attempt to seek justice. This meant that many acts of sexual violence went unreported and unpunished, with the perpetrators facing little to no accountability. This pervasive lack of legal protection created a climate of impunity for aggressors, profoundly endangering women's bodily autonomy and safety. Consider the plight of women caught in the turbulent political and social landscapes of 820 AD. During periods of conflict or banditry, women were frequently targets of abduction, enslavement, or sexual violence. Without a recognized legal identity, they had no formal means of seeking protection from local authorities, nor could they easily appeal to a distant king or emperor. Their fate often depended on the ability of their male relatives to defend them, or to negotiate their release or return. If these men were unable or unwilling, the woman was left entirely to her own devices with no legal framework to safeguard her freedom or her body. Historical accounts, though typically written by men, occasionally hint at the widespread vulnerability of women in such unstable times, a vulnerability exacerbated by their legal non-existence. The concept of honor killings, while not universally codified, was a brutal reality in some regions, reflecting a societal emphasis on male honor over a woman's life. If a woman was perceived to have brought dishonor to her family, perhaps through adultery or being a victim of sexual assault, her male relatives might take violent action against her with little to no legal repercussions. The lack of legal identity meant her life was not intrinsically valued by the state as an individual human life, but as an extension of male family reputation, subject to the severe judgments of those who claimed authority over her. Even outside of overt violence, women were vulnerable to various forms of exploitation. Without the ability to independently own property or control their earnings, they could be exploited economically by male relatives or employers. They might be forced into labor without fair compensation, or their inheritance might be misappropriated. Their lack of legal standing meant they could not challenge these injustices in court. This pervasive vulnerability underscored the reality that for women in 820 AD, true protection was not a right guaranteed by law, but a privilege contingent on the goodwill and power of the men in their lives. The absence of a robust legal identity meant that their suffering often remained silent, unaddressed by a legal system that, in many profound ways, simply did not see them as individuals deserving of autonomous protection. Number 1. Cast in clay. When your life story is not your own, the ultimate and most profound harm caused by a woman's lack of legal identity in 820 AD was the systematic erasure of her life story, her contributions, and her very existence from the official narratives and public life of her time. When you possess no independent legal personality, when your actions are mediated through a man, and when your testimony holds little weight, your experiences become largely unrecorded. Your achievements go uncelebrated in formal histories, and your ability to shape the world around you is severely curtailed. This wasn't just about missing out on recognition. It was about being metaphorically cast in clay, shaped by others with little power to mold your own destiny or leave an enduring mark on the world on your own terms. Consider the realm of public life and governance. In 820, and across most major civilizations, women were almost universally excluded from holding public office, serving in legal capacities, or participating in decision-making assemblies. In the Carolingian Empire, the assemblies and councils that governed the realm enacted laws and dispensed justice were exclusively male. Women could not be judges, scribes, or advisors in any official capacity. Even queens or empresses, though they might wield significant informal power through their husbands or sons, did so within the confines of a patriarchal system that did not recognize their independent political authority based on their own personhood. Their power was derived from their relationship to the male ruler, not from an inherent right to govern. This meant that the perspectives and needs of half the population were systematically absent from the formation of laws and policies that governed everyone's lives. Education, a key to intellectual development and public influence, was also largely restricted for women. While some aristocratic women might receive private tutoring in literacy, religious texts, or domestic management, formal schooling was primarily for boys, preparing them for roles in the church, government, or military. The vast majority of women were illiterate, denied access to the knowledge and skills that would allow them to engage in intellectual discourse, create written works, or even fully understand the legal documents that dictated their lives. This lack of access to formal education meant that women's voices, thoughts, and intellectual contributions were rarely captured in the written records of the time, leading to their historical invisibility. How could one write their own story when they were not taught how to write? The public sphere, encompassing trade, scholarship, law, and politics, was overwhelmingly male. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, their influence limited to the household and immediate family networks. While these domestic roles were undoubtedly crucial for societal functioning, they were rarely seen as having public value or deserving of official recognition. The stories that were told, the histories that were written, the monuments that were built, all reflected a male-centric view of the world, effectively erasing women's contributions and experiences from the collective memory. Scholars today piece together women's lives from indirect sources, mentions in wills, legal disputes where they were represented, or religious texts, precisely because women were rarely the subjects or authors of their own historical narratives. Even within religious institutions, where women sometimes found avenues for leadership, such as in convents or certain spiritual movements, their ultimate authority was often subject to male ecclesiastical hierarchy. While abbesses in Europe, for example, could be powerful figures managing vast estates and commanding respect, their spiritual authority was still often subordinate to bishops or male monastic orders, and their influence remained largely within the religious sphere, distinct from the broader political or legal landscape. In the Tang dynasty, despite the occasional powerful empress or concubine who might exert extraordinary influence, these were exceptions that often highlighted the rule. Their power was tenuous, often dependent on cunning and political maneuvering rather than legitimate, codified authority. The legal and social structures consistently reinforced the idea that women's place was at home, supporting their men, and that their contributions were not to be publicly celebrated or officially recognized. The official histories, compiled by male scholars, largely focused on the achievements of emperors, generals, and male officials, leaving women's lives mostly unrecorded save for their roles as wives, mothers, or occasional instigators of political intrigue. The absence of legal identity meant that a woman's life story, her personal experiences, her joys, and her sorrows were largely private matters, often unremarked upon by the official chroniclers of the age. Her individual accomplishments, her wisdom, her resilience, or her unique character were not deemed worthy of public record. She could not easily bequeath a legacy in her own name, publish her own thoughts, or assert her unique identity in a way that would endure beyond her immediate family. Her life, in the grand scheme of things, was simply not considered a narrative worth preserving independently. This profound erasure meant that women were not just harmed by their lack of rights in their lifetime. They were also harmed in posterity. Their voices, their struggles, their triumphs, and their very existence were often lost to history, making it incredibly difficult for subsequent generations to fully understand their realities or to appreciate their hidden resilience. They were cast in the prevailing mold of patriarchy, unable to leave their unique individual impressions on the historical record. Their life stories, if they were told at all, were usually filtered through a male lens, shaped by male expectations and priorities, leaving them in a silent, often forgotten chapter of history.